The limestone dust settled thick in the afternoon heat as Roman soldiers moved methodically through narrow streets, torches in hand. Families clutched small bundles, a copper lamp, a clay jar, scrolls wrapped in linen, while behind them pillars cracked and roofs collapsed inward. The smell of burning olive wood mixed with distant screams. In less than 3 hours, a city that had stood for 8 centuries would become rubble, its name soon forgotten by all but those who once called it home. What does it mean for an entire city to vanish from human memory? Not simply to fall in battle or decline gradually into ruins, but to be deliberately erased, its stones scattered, its population scattered or enslaved, its very name forbidden to be spoken. We speak casually of Pompeii preserved under ash or Athens declining through centuries, but these cities remained visible, their locations never lost. Far from gradual abandonment, some biblical cities experienced systematic obliteration. Armies breaking every wall stone by stone, plowing salt into fields, redirecting water sources, resettling survivors hundreds of miles away. 2,000 years ago, inhabitants of these doomed cities woke each morning to familiar routines, drawing water from communal wells, baking bread in shared ovens, teaching children to read Torah in synagogue courtyards, arguing about Roman taxes in marketplace shadows, never imagining that within a generation their home would exist only in distant memories and disputed texts. For centuries, we have imagined biblical destruction as dramatic but temporary. Cities conquered, then rebuilt under new management, inhabitants continuing mostly unchanged lives under different rulers. But archaeological evidence reveals something far more devastating and deliberate. When Rome decided to erase a city, engineers surveyed foundation stones for complete removal. Soldiers received orders to demolish not just defensive walls but private homes, not just temples, but granaries and cisterns. Survivors smelled smoke for weeks afterward as timber and stored grain continued smoldering. The sound of systematic demolition, hammers on stone, crowbars levering foundation blocks, timber crashing, continued for months. The taste of limestone dust hung in the air for seasons. These were not random acts of war, but calculated acts of historical erasure. Understanding this violence is not merely archaeological curiosity. It helps us grasp why Jesus wept over Jerusalem, why prophets spoke of cities that shall not be found, why the Gospels record urgent warnings about coming destruction. Physical obliteration taught spiritual lessons about pride, covenant unfaithfulness, and divine judgment that shaped Jewish and Christian theology for millennia. When we examine these erased cities, many details of the Gospels gain new and deeper meaning. Stay until the end, because what you are about to discover goes beyond historical curiosity and can strengthen our faith today. But this systematic erasure required specific physical methods that Roman military engineering had perfected over centuries. When orders came to obliterate a city completely, legionaries didn't simply set fires and leave. They brought specialized equipment: iron crowbars weighing 15 pounds, bronze-headed hammers, wooden levers 12 feet long, rope pulleys, and carts for hauling stone. The work began at dawn and continued until dusk, organized in shifts. Soldiers worked in teams of 4, 2 on crowbars, 2 pulling ropes, to topple walls stone by stone rather than merely breaking them. The sound was relentless. Metal striking limestone, blocks crashing onto rubble piles, timber supports splintering. Citizens forced to watch described choking on clouds of white dust that coated throats and stung eyes. The smell of fresh broken stone, sharp, mineral, acrid, filled the air for weeks. Unlike the quick violence of battle, this demolition was methodical, almost rhythmic, the work of engineers executing a comprehensive plan. Roman protocol demanded complete destruction, not partial damage. Foundation stones weighing 2 tons were excavated and hauled away for reuse in Roman construction projects miles distant. Wooden beams were salvaged for firewood or military camps. Bronze fittings, iron hinges, even clay roof tiles were collected and redistributed. Water systems received special attention. Engineers collapsed cistern roofs, filled wells with rubble, broke aqueduct channels, and diverted springs, Without water, no population could return. Agricultural infrastructure was similarly targeted. Olive presses smashed, grain storage pits filled with stone and debris, terraced fields deliberately eroded by destroying retaining walls. This was not random vandalism, but calculated economic destruction. A city could not rebuild if its economic foundation was systematically eliminated. The work was not quick. Archaeological evidence from several erased cities shows demolition continued for 3 to 6 months after military conquest. This extended timeline reveals Roman intentionality. The goal was not merely military victory, but permanent erasure. Teams of surveyors marked buildings for complete removal versus partial destruction. Valuable materials were cataloged and transported. Population registers were burned to prevent survivors from claiming property rights. Legal documents establishing city charters, tax records, land deeds, all were destroyed. The physical destruction of buildings was matched by bureaucratic erasure. A city disappeared not just from the landscape, but from administrative records, tax rolls, military maps. When demolition finally ended, what remained resembled a quarry more than a city. Scattered stone piles, exposed bedrock, broken pottery shards, and ash layers 3 feet deep. Jesus learned what systematic destruction looked like. He grew up hearing stories from survivors of cities Rome had erased during the previous century's rebellions. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body. The sight of homeless families on Galilean roads, the sound of elderly refugees recounting lost homes, the knowledge that Roman power could erase entire communities. This understanding shaped his warnings about Jerusalem's coming fate. Later, when Jesus spoke about not one stone left upon another, he was not creating metaphors. He was describing the specific engineering practice of complete urban demolition that his contemporaries recognized from recent history. This reveals something fundamental about why biblical prophecies of judgment used such physically specific language. They reflected real historical practices, not merely symbolic imagery. When Rome decided which cities to erase completely, the decision followed clear social and political logic, not random military anger. Cities marked for total destruction shared common characteristics. They had led rebellions, sheltered resistance leaders, refused tribute payments, or violated treaties. But beyond these official justifications, the pattern reveals class dimensions. Wealthy cities with influential citizens who maintained connections to Roman senators often negotiated survival even after rebellion. Poor cities with no political advocates faced erasure. The social organization of destruction thus reflected broader Roman attitudes about which populations mattered and which were expendable. Inhabitants experienced this class division viscerally in the final days before obliteration. Wealthy families with Roman connections received advance warnings, unofficial messages from sympathetic officers, opportunities to evacuate with portable wealth, promises of safe passage to coastal cities. They departed quietly before siege walls closed, carrying silver coins, jewelry, and legal documents proving property ownership elsewhere. Poor families had no such options. They remained until the end, trapped between advancing armies and locked city gates, survival reduced to hiding food and water for the coming siege. This was not choice, but the brutal mathematics of poverty. Those without resources, connections, or advance information faced destruction without alternatives. The aftermath revealed even starker class realities. Wealthy survivors could purchase new homes in other cities, re-establish businesses using transported capital, and maintain social status despite displacement. Poor survivors became refugees without resources, legal status, or marketable skills beyond subsistence agriculture. They crowded into already poor districts of other cities, accepted exploitative labor contracts, or became bandits in the countryside. Ancient sources describe roads filled with displaced people begging for food, children separated from families, elderly unable to keep pace with refugee columns. The social fabric that had sustained poor communities, extended family networks, mutual aid systems, shared resources, disintegrated with the city's physical destruction. Wealth could be portable, community could not. Jesus learned about these refugee realities from direct observation. Galilee absorbed displaced populations from erased cities throughout his childhood and young adulthood. He grew up understanding that Roman destruction created two categories of survivors: those with means to restart elsewhere, and those without resources condemned to permanent precarity. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body. The sight of refugee families camped outside village walls, the economic strain on communities absorbing the displaced, the anger and grief of those who had lost everything. Later, when Jesus spoke about foxes having holes and birds having nests, but the Son of Man having nowhere to lay his head, he was not creating metaphors. He was describing the refugee existence that thousands knew intimately after their city's erasure. And it is precisely this that begins to reveal why gospel warnings about Jerusalem's destruction carried such urgent social implications. Listeners knew exactly what total destruction meant for the poor. Beyond the immediate violence of demolition lay a longer temporal process, the deliberate cultivation of forgetting. Rome understood that truly erasing a city required not just physical destruction, but memory destruction. This took generations, not months. The process began with renaming. If a city was rebuilt at all, it received a new Latin name severing connection to its previous identity. Maps were redrawn, showing empty space where the city once stood. Official histories omitted the city's name or mentioned it only as a negative example of rebellion's consequences. Within 2 generations, children grew up never hearing the city's original name spoken. This temporal dimension of erasure operated differently than the swift violence of conquest. Physical destruction happened in months. Memory destruction required decades of sustained effort. Colonial administrators prohibited speaking the city's name in legal proceedings, marketplaces, or public assemblies. Fines punished parents who named children after the erased city. Teachers in Roman-sponsored schools taught regional history with significant omissions. Trade routes were redirected away from the empty site. New settlements were founded nearby, but deliberately not on the original location, creating geographic confusion. Over time, even survivors' descendants lost precise knowledge of where their ancestral city had stood. The rhythm of this forgetting varied by social class and generation. First-generation survivors maintained detailed memories. They could describe every street, name every family, recount local customs and festivals. They gathered privately to share stories, maintaining oral traditions despite official prohibition. But second-generation children, born in exile, knew the city only through parents' stories, never having walked its streets or participated in its communal life. Their knowledge was second-hand, abstracted, increasingly mythologized. Third-generation descendants often knew only that their family came from somewhere in Judea without specific details. The city became a vague ancestral reference rather than a living memory. Within a century, precise knowledge survived only in a few family lineages or written texts preserved by religious communities. Jesus learned the fragility of collective memory. He grew up in a culture where oral tradition fought against imperial erasure, where maintaining accurate historical memory was an act of resistance. He understood that remembering required intentional practice, repeated storytelling, ritualized commemoration, written preservation. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body, the effort required to memorize long genealogies, the importance communities placed on accurate historical recounting, the anxiety about forgetting that motivated scribal precision. Later, when Jesus commanded his disciples to do this in remembrance of me, he was not creating metaphors. He was instituting a specific practice to prevent the erasure of his life and teachings through the same temporal processes that had obliterated cities. This detail profoundly alters how we understand early Christian emphasis on remembering. It was not mere sentiment, but survival strategy against historical erasure. Theridiobas, in the theological interpretation of total urban destruction, developed gradually within Jewish thought, shaped by repeated experiences of cities erased by successive empires. By Jesus' time, A mature theology existed connecting physical obliteration to covenant faithfulness, divine judgment, and prophetic warning. But this theology was not abstract speculation. It emerged from traumatic historical experiences interpreted through sustained religious reflection. Communities that witnessed erasure asked profound questions. Why did God allow this? What sin warranted such complete judgment? Could anything survive total destruction? How should survivors maintain faith after such devastation? These questions produced diverse theological answers. Some teachers emphasized covenant unfaithfulness. Cities erased had abandoned Torah, welcomed idolatry, oppressed the poor, or collaborated with pagan powers. Destruction was divine judgment implemented through human armies. Others stressed apocalyptic timeframes. Present suffering was birth pangs of a coming age, when God would restore Israel and judge oppressing nations. Still others focused on remnant theology. God always preserved a faithful few who would rebuild after judgment passed. These competing interpretations coexisted, each offering different pastoral responses to trauma and different hopes for the future. The spiritual formation that occurred in the shadow of potential erasure shaped distinctive religious practices. Communities under threat intensified Torah study, correctly perceiving that religious texts survived better than physical structures. Scribal schools multiplied, training young men to copy and interpret texts with extreme precision. Oral tradition became systematized, with memorization techniques ensuring accurate transmission, even if written texts were destroyed. Prayer liturgies incorporated laments for destroyed cities and petitions for divine protection. Religious identity became increasingly textual and portable, rather than temple-centered and geographically fixed. This shift was not merely adaptive, but theologically creative. It produced new understandings of how God's presence could exist apart from particular locations. Jesus learned theology in this context of threatened erasure. His religious education occurred in communities that had experienced destruction and feared its return. He grew up understanding that God's kingdom could not be identified with any physical structure or political entity vulnerable to imperial power. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body. The anxiety communities felt about Jerusalem's future, the debates about whether God would allow the temple's destruction again, the tension between hope for divine intervention and fear of divine judgment. Later, when Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God not being here or there, but within and among people, he was not creating metaphors. He was articulating a theology adapted to the reality of potential erasure, a faith that could survive the destruction of its physical centers. This reveals something fundamental about Christianity's early development. Its portable, text-based, community-centered structure was not accidental but forged in response to the historical reality of cities and temples that could be erased. To conclude, reflect on what these erased cities teach us. When we observe the systematic destruction of biblical cities, we realize that ancient populations faced not just military defeat, but calculated attempts to obliterate their very existence from history. The physical violence of demolition teams breaking foundations stone by stone, the social violence of class divisions that allowed wealthy survivors to escape while the poor perished or became refugees, the temporal violence of deliberate forgetting that erased cities from collective memory within generations, and the spiritual formation that occurred in communities living under threat of total erasure. These dimensions reveal how profoundly historical trauma shaped biblical faith. Jesus knew the smell of refugee camps along Galilean roadsides, the sight of elderly survivors recounting lost homes, the sound of debates about whether God would allow Jerusalem's temple to fall again, the weight of maintaining memory against imperial forgetting. And it was on this common ground of threatened communities, potential erasure, and adaptive faith that his teaching about the kingdom of God was prepared. He did not offer security through political power or geographical centers, vulnerable to destruction. Instead, he taught a kingdom present wherever two or three gathered in his name, a faith that could survive the destruction of its physical foundations because it was founded on communal practice and textual memory rather than temples and cities. Understanding this daily life changes the way we read the Gospels. His warnings about Jerusalem's coming destruction were not merely prophetic, but practically informed by historical patterns his contemporaries recognized immediately. God acts in the invisible, in the simple, in what seems small. The method has not changed. Just as faith survived the erasure of cities by becoming portable and community-based, just as religious identity adapted to exist without geographical centers, so too contemporary faith must recognize that its foundation rests not in buildings or institutions, but in practices of remembering, communal gathering, and textual engagement. This calls us to reflection about where we locate our faith's security. Do we trust structures that can be destroyed, institutions vulnerable to historical forces, or geographical centers that can be erased? Or have we learned the lesson these obliterated cities taught, that true faith survives because it is carried in hearts, enacted in communities, and transmitted through faithful remembering? And if this documentary strengthened your faith and expanded your understanding of how historical trauma shaped biblical theology, leave your like, comment on what you found most interesting, and share this video. Your support helps carry this story forward. Until the next video.